Stuart and his wife Alice had just moved into their new house. It was the home of their dreams, a classic-style building in a quiet neighborhood. The couple were delighted with the space, the spacious rooms, and especially the garden, where they planned to spend many relaxing afternoons. Everything seemed perfect. They spent the first few days adjusting to their surroundings, arranging the furniture, and putting into practice the small renovations they had planned. The place was comfortable and, above all, welcoming. But within the first few days, Stuart began to feel something different. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A strange sensation, a slight change in the air, especially in the master bedroom dressing room and the bathroom next door. He didn't take much notice of it at first, believing it was just nerves from the move or tiredness from daily activities. Alice, for her part, didn't mention anything, and Stuart preferred to keep his thoughts to himself. The nights, however, brought more restlessness. Although silence prevailed most of the time, sometimes Stuart thought he heard small noises coming from the hallway near the closet. They were muffled sounds, almost like light knocks or something falling on the floor. He got up and checked the room, but never found anything out of place. Everything remained as it was. Alice, still enthusiastic about her new home, didn't seem to notice these little disturbances. Stuart, on the other hand, began to notice that the discomfort increased whenever he was alone in the room. Something in the closet made him uncomfortable, an almost imperceptible presence, as if the air was heavier there, even if he couldn't identify exactly what it was. The first few nights, Stuart tried to push the feeling away. Perhaps it was just the weight of responsibility of being in a new house, with all the pressure of adapting. However, he couldn't ignore the slight feeling that he was being watched, especially when he passed the bathroom or left the closet door ajar. Gradually, an uneasiness began to settle in his mind, but he still hesitated to speak to Alice, fearful of appearing unreasonable. As the days went by, Stuart realized that his discomfort wasn't diminishing. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify. The closet, always a practical and ordinary place, now seemed to hide something invisible to his eyes. The persistent feeling that there was something there, hidden in the shadows, began to disturb his nights of sleep. The atmosphere of the house, once welcoming, now seemed shrouded in a strange, silent tension. It was the beginning of something he still didn't understand, but the feeling that something wasn't right was becoming more and more present. The next few days passed without much happening, but Stuart still had that uncomfortable feeling that he couldn't explain. He tried to ignore the discomfort, while Alice continued to be excited about the plans for the garden and the small renovations that would make the house even more perfect. However, the behavior of Thor, the couple's German Shepherd puppy, began to change in a disturbing way. It was a quiet morning, and Stuart was having his coffee in the kitchen when he noticed Thor standing in the hallway, his body stiff and his gaze fixed on the closet. His hair was bristling, and the dog emitted a low growl, as if alerting him to something only he could see. Stuart called the dog, but Thor remained motionless, staring into the void with a frightening intensity. "Thor, come here!" Stuart called again, now with a firmer voice, trying to disguise his own nervousness. The dog finally looked away and ran towards his owner, but his unease was evident. He stayed by Stuart's side, but continued to stare down the corridor, always looking alert. Intrigued, Stuart walked to the closet, opened the door and looked around. The clothes were exactly as they had been left, and there was no sign that anything was out of place. He even crouched down and looked for any hint of rodents or any other animal that might be bothering the dog, but found nothing. Over the next few days, Thor's behavior became even more peculiar. Whenever he passed the closet or the bathroom, the dog would stop and watch for a few seconds, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. He wagged his tail, but his gaze was a mixture of curiosity and alertness. Alice even joked about his behavior, saying that Thor was trying to protect the couple from some imaginary ghost. Stuart laughed it off, but inside he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something else was going on. The nights were still strange too. The knocks in the hallway became more frequent, and he would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing faint sounds, almost as if someone was moving something on the other side of the house. Trying not to alarm Alice, Stuart began to take notes on Thor's behavior. He noticed that the dog seemed more restless at night, especially around midnight. It was always the same pattern. Thor would start moving around the house with light steps, stopping in front of the closet and the bathroom. He would stare at these rooms, as if he expected to see something appear out of nowhere. Stuart tried to justify the situation, thinking that perhaps it was just the dog adapting to his new home. After all, dogs are sensitive to change and can be bothered by unfamiliar sounds or smells. But the more he tried to rationalize, the more the feeling that something was wrong grew inside him. One particularly quiet night, Stuart woke up to Thor barking furiously. The dog was at the bedroom door, staring down the corridor with his teeth bared, as if he were facing an invisible threat. Stuart turned on the light, but saw nothing. Thor continued to bark, however, and this time Alice woke up too, startled by the noise. "What's happening to him?" asked Alice, her eyes still half closed with sleep. "I don't know. Maybe he heard some noise outside," replied Stuart, trying to calm her down, although he knew that Thor's barking was unusual. He went downstairs to check the house, but everything was in order. Deep down, he knew it wasn't something physical that was bothering the dog. When he returned to the bedroom, Thor was lying down, but he was still watching the closet door intently. Stuart decided that he needed to find out what was behind the strange sensation that had been growing in both him and his faithful four-legged companion. What had once seemed like a simple adaptation to the new house was now turning into a mystery that was beginning to haunt his mind more intensely. The nights continued, but now restlessness was a constant presence in Stuart's mind. What began with faint sounds in the hallway and Thor's strange behavior evolved into something more intense. The knocks, which had previously seemed occasional, began to come at unexpected moments, and the noises, once muffled, were now clearer, echoing through the house. One morning, Stuart woke up to a distinctive sound. 3 firm knocks coming from the bathroom. He got up slowly, his heart racing, trying not to make a sound so as not to wake Alice. Thor was already sitting beside the bed, completely silent, but with his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. It was as if the dog was waiting for something. "Stay here, kid," murmured Stuart, trying to sound calm, although he wasn't himself. He walked across the room with light steps, approaching the bathroom door. The tension grew with every step. The air seemed colder, and there was an unusual, almost oppressive silence that filled the house. He opened the bathroom door, breathing heavily, and turned on the light. Everything was in its place. The sink, the cupboards, the mirror. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Stuart looked around, searching for some logical explanation. Perhaps it was just the pipes, a sound caused by the old structure of the house. But when he looked at the mirror, he felt a shiver run up his spine. There was a condensation mark, as if something or someone had pressed their fingers against the cold surface. He rubbed the mirror, but the mark wouldn't go away. The chill in the room became more intense, almost freezing. He tried not to pay too much attention to what he had just seen and returned to his room, forcing himself to believe that it was just an insignificant detail. But that night, Stuart's dreams were disturbing. In his nightmares, he walked through the dark house, being followed by a shadow that seemed to disappear whenever he turned around. The presence watched him, surrounded him, but never revealed itself completely. He woke up in a cold sweat several times and always found Thor sitting in his bedroom doorway, watchful, as if on guard. Over the next few days, Stuart began to notice a pattern. Always around 3 in the morning, the sounds in the corridor repeated themselves. 3 knocks, like a signal. The dog no longer reacted with the same intensity, but remained alert, following Stuart closely. Alice still hadn't noticed anything unusual. For her, the evenings were quiet, and she continued to be involved in the renovations and preparations for the garden. Stuart, however, was beginning to feel exhausted. The interrupted sleep, the constant noises, the invisible presence he felt at night, everything seemed to contribute to a mental fatigue that he couldn't explain. Even during the day, the house seemed to carry a weight, a different atmosphere from what they had experienced when they moved in. The closet in particular had become a place he instinctively avoided. Whenever he needed to look for something there, Stuart felt a pressure in the air, something almost tangible, as if the space was filled. Despite this, he didn't mention his feelings to Alice. He didn't want to scare her or seem paranoid. But the nights continued to be a test of nerves. One night, while he was trying to fall asleep, he heard the 3 knocks again. This time, Thor didn't move. The dog remained lying on the side of the bed, but his eyes moved towards the closet, as if he knew something was approaching. Stuart closed his eyes, trying to ignore it, but the feeling that he and his family were not alone in that house grew stronger every night. Something was with them, something invisible that only Thor seemed to fully recognize. Deep down, Stuart knew that this was only the beginning. After several nights of disturbed sleep and the unsettling feeling of being watched, Stuart decided to take action. He wasn't the kind of person who easily believed in ghosts or supernatural entities, but the strange events in his house were making him reconsider. He then decided to install security cameras inside the bedroom and in the hallway, especially focusing on the closet and bathroom, where the phenomena seemed most intense. That night, he felt safer knowing that everything was being recorded. Perhaps by reviewing the images the next day, he would finally be able to come up with a rational explanation for what had been happening. Alice, always practical and unaware of the seriousness of the situation, just laughed when he commented on the cameras, saying that he was obsessing unnecessarily. Even so, she wasn't opposed to the idea. Dawn came and, as expected, at around 3 in the morning, Stuart was woken up by a faint sound coming from the hallway. The knocks were there again, in the same rhythm, and this time he paid more attention. They seemed closer than ever, as if something was knocking on the closet door. He sat up in bed and looked at Thor, who was already standing, staring at the same spot as always, the closet. Stuart took a deep breath and decided not to get out of bed at that moment. He knew the cameras were recording everything, so he controlled himself to wait until the next morning. As soon as the sun began to rise, he anxiously got up, grabbed his laptop, and started reviewing the night's footage. As he advanced the video to a specific moment, he noticed something unusual. In the corridor, next to the closet, there was a small point of light, an orb that floated in a strange way. It was almost imperceptible, but it was definitely there. He saw the orb move slowly from the top of the screen to the bottom, disappearing towards the floor. Stuart paused the video and blinked several times, trying to convince himself that it was just a fault in the camera or a speck of dust reflecting the light. Deciding to take a closer look, he adjusted the video, changing the lighting and contrast. At first, the orb seemed more visible, but there was nothing particularly frightening about it. However, when he paid attention in the final seconds, something strange caught his eye. A shadow. It wasn't the orb, but something else. A shape he hadn't noticed before. It appeared for a fraction of a second in the left-hand corner of the screen, near the closet door, and then disappeared. He showed the images to Alice, who watched curiously. "It's probably just a reflection, love," she said, downplaying the situation. But Stuart wasn't convinced. He knew what he had seen, and the idea that it could just be a coincidence seemed less and less likely. Thor's reaction didn't go unnoticed either. The dog, who was always alert at dawn, seemed to be observing something that Stuart couldn't see. Thor followed the orb with his eyes, almost hypnotically, and then barked in the direction of the closet, as if there was something else there that the video didn't capture. Stuart spent the rest of the day puzzled. What could that shadow be? The idea that it was just a technical problem with the camera no longer seemed convincing. He started searching the internet for orbs, shadows, and supernatural recordings, trying to find similar reports. To his surprise, he found several accounts of people who had captured orbs on video, often associated with spiritual presences. He posted the video on a debate forum about paranormal phenomena, seeking other people's opinions. Many commented that it seemed to be a manifestation of energy, something benign, since the orb moved calmly and the dog didn't seem completely terrified. Others, however, warned that the shadow could be a sign of something darker, something that had not yet fully revealed itself. The responses left Stuart even more confused and apprehensive. Although some said the orb was harmless, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease he felt about the shadow. There was something else in that house, something that he and his family still didn't fully understand. And just as the orb floated silently across the screen, a silent doubt began to form in Stuart's mind. Was this just the start of something much bigger? Stuart spent the week reviewing the video of the orb and the strange shadows over and over again, trying to find a logical explanation for what he had captured. However, the more he watched, the more certain he became that this was no ordinary occurrence. Thor's behavior, which continued to get more and more restless, made him even more worried. Thor, who had always been a calm and cheerful dog, now seemed to be in a constant state of alert. His walks down the corridor became almost ritual. Every night, around 3 in the morning, he would position himself in front of the closet or the bathroom, his body tense and his eyes fixed, as if something invisible was there, but only he could see it. Stuart was beginning to notice a pattern that couldn't be ignored. One night, while Alice was sound asleep, Stuart was awoken again by Thor's barking. It was no ordinary bark of warning or irritation, but a low, repeated sound, as if he was trying to communicate with something. Thor stood in front of the closet, his tail wagging slightly, but his eyes were fixed on the dark interior of the space, as if he were observing something inside. Stuart got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and went over to the dog. As he approached, he felt a shiver run down his spine. That cold, dense air he had noticed before seemed to have intensified. He tried to calm Thor down, but the dog remained focused on the closet, as if waiting for an answer. "Hey, Thor, what's wrong?" "What do you see?" murmured Stuart, running his hand over the dog's back. Suddenly, Thor began to bark more intensely, his posture changing from curiosity to total alertness. Stuart turned around quickly, expecting to see something, but the closet was empty. He looked into the dark interior with clothes hanging and boxes on the floor, and felt the same sensation of being watched, that same invisible presence. Unable to stop himself, Stuart took out his cell phone and started recording. He didn't know exactly what he was hoping to capture, but he felt he needed to document that moment. Thor kept barking and suddenly fell silent, his eyes still fixed on the inside of the closet. Stuart held his breath, waiting for something. Then, from inside the closet, came a distinct sound, a slight whisper, almost inaudible, as if someone was talking very quietly. Stuart took a step back in disbelief. He looked at his cell phone, trying to catch the sound, but there was nothing else. Thor, on the other hand, went back to wagging his tail, as if everything was over and the danger, if any, had passed. Stuart stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. He looked at the closet again, trying to calm his racing heart. It was clear that Thor was reacting to something he couldn't fully see or hear. But what was it? And why, even in the midst of this, did the dog not seem terrified, but curious, even friendly? The next morning, Stuart reviewed the recording from the night before. The video showed exactly what he expected. Thor standing there, barking at the closet, with Stuart by his side. However, the audio was different. By turning the volume up to maximum, Stuart could clearly hear the same whisper he had heard the night before. It was a faint sound, but the words were unintelligible, as if someone was trying to say something, but to no avail. Stuart showed the video to Alice, who finally began to worry. That's real. I heard it too. What do you think it could be? Maybe we should call someone, Stuart. But who to call? An expert in supernatural events? A priest? Stuart didn't know. The thought that his house was being inhabited by an entity, whatever it was beginning to take over his mind. Over the next few days, he noticed that Thor continued to follow the pattern. The knocks continued, the whispers were sporadic, and the feeling of being watched only grew. What had begun as a slight discomfort was turning into something deeper, something that Stuart could no longer ignore. Although the presence didn't seem hostile, Thor's growing interaction with the invisible made him uneasy. What if this hitherto seemingly harmless entity was just getting closer, gaining strength? With these questions running through his head, Stuart knew he had to go beyond the cameras and try to understand what exactly was going on inside the walls of his house. Something was there, and it seemed that, somehow, his dog had become the intermediary. Stuart was becoming more and more immersed in the strangeness that surrounded his house. The nights became long and disturbing, and he was rarely able to sleep peacefully. Alice, although still hesitant to admit what was happening, was beginning to feel the weight of the dark atmosphere hanging over them. Thor's behavior didn't change either. The dog remained fixated on something that Stuart and Alice couldn't see. One particularly cold night, Stuart was woken up by a different sound. It wasn't the usual soft knocking or distant whispering. This time, it was a deeper noise, something that seemed to come from inside the wall, as if there was something moving in the structure of the house. He looked at the clock, 3:15 in the morning. Almost like a gloomy clock, things always got more intense at that time. Stuart got up, put on a coat, and went into the hallway, where Thor was already in position as usual. The dog kept his gaze fixed on the bathroom this time, instead of the closet. Stuart followed Thor's gaze, and a heavy feeling took hold of his chest. There was nothing there at first glance, but the air seemed denser, as if the room itself was breathing hard. With careful steps, Stuart approached the bathroom door. He felt a slight tremor in his hands, a reflection of his growing fear and exhaustion. He opened the door slowly, trying to keep control of the situation. The bathroom was in semi-darkness, lit only by the dim streetlight coming in through the window. Everything was in its place, except for the mirror, which again showed condensation marks, as if someone had run their fingers across it, drawing imperfect, distorted lines. When Stuart touched the surface of the mirror, an intense chill ran across his skin, and Thor, who was right behind him, began to growl softly, the sound reverberating in the small bathroom. Stuart looked at his reflection in the mirror, and for a moment he thought he saw something pass quickly behind him. He turned around, but there was no one. The corridor was empty except for Thor, who was now restless. Trying not to panic, Stuart took out his cell phone and decided to record what was happening, as he had done before. He felt that, once again, he needed proof of what he was experiencing. He started filming the mirror, the bathroom, Thor, and the corridor, documenting the strange sensation that was enveloping him. It was then that the knocks started again. This time, louder. 3 dry thuds coming directly from the wall behind the mirror. Thor started barking loudly, his eyes wide, and Stuart felt helpless in the face of what was happening. He touched the wall, trying to identify where the sound was coming from, but it was as if something was moving inside, something large and disturbing. Suddenly, Thor stopped barking. The dog sat on the floor, his tail moving slightly, as if the threat had disappeared. Stuart looked at the dog, confused by the sudden change in behavior. He took a few steps back, still unable to understand the situation. Whatever was in the house seemed to be playing with them, showing itself and disappearing, without ever revealing itself completely. He returned to the bedroom, where Alice was fast asleep, oblivious to what had just happened. Stuart sat on the edge of the bed, cell phone still in hand. He knew he would need to watch the recording to try to understand if anything else had been captured. His heart was racing and his mind was racing, full of unanswered questions. As he watched the video, he realized that once again, the orb was present. This time, it was moving more slowly, almost as if it were casually floating down the corridor from the bathroom door to the closet. Thor followed it with his eyes on the video, but what caught Stuart's attention was the reflection in the mirror. He froze the image and, in the top right-hand corner, saw a shadow, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Something was moving quickly, and it wasn't him or Thor. Unlike the previous nights, this shadow seemed to be more defined, more present, as if it were gaining strength as the days went by. Stuart paused the video several times, zooming in on the image, but he couldn't identify what it was. All he knew was that it shouldn't be there. What was it? Why was it becoming more and more active? These questions began to haunt him throughout the day. He felt the presence all the time, like an invisible shadow hanging over his house. But what disturbed him most was Thor's calmness at crucial moments. The dog seemed to recognize the presence, and although he acted like a guard dog, he often showed a strange acceptance, as if he knew that the entity posed no immediate threat. But Stuart couldn't ignore the growing intensity of events. Something was manifesting itself, and he knew he would need to go beyond recordings and observations if he wanted to understand what was really going on in that house. Stuart could no longer ignore the signs. The sleepless nights and the increasingly disturbing videos were slowly eroding his sanity. The shadow in the mirror, the unexplained sounds, and Thor's behavior had become part of the nightly routine, but at the same time they seemed to intensify the feeling that something was waiting for its moment to reveal itself. During the day, the house was strangely quiet, as if the presence Stuart felt withdrew with the sunlight. Alice, although she was beginning to recognize that there was something out of the ordinary, still preferred to believe that it was all the result of Stuart's anxiety. She tried to remain optimistic, focusing on the renovations and the plans for the garden, while he plunged deeper and deeper into a silent investigation. One day, Stuart decided to review all the videos he had recorded over the previous weeks. He sat down in front of his laptop with Thor by his side as usual and began to carefully observe every detail. His attention was focused on the shadows and the small orbs of light, but this time something else caught his eye. In one of the videos, recorded 3 nights earlier, he noticed a movement at the end of the corridor, something he hadn't noticed until then. It wasn't just the light or the orb. It was a shape, almost imperceptible, that seemed to be peeking out from the entrance to the closet. Stuart paused the video and increased the brightness of the image, trying to better define what he was seeing. It was as if something was moving in the shadows, a humanoid figure, but nebulous, almost like a distortion of the environment. He watched it several times in slow motion, trying to understand what it could be. The figure seemed to move fluidly, almost floating, and then disappeared into the darkness of the closet. His heart raced. He knew it wasn't a camera glitch. It was something real, something that was in the house with them. "This isn't normal," whispered Stuart to himself, wiping his hand across his face in frustration. He called Alice over to watch, in the hope that she could see what he had captured. When she sat down next to him and watched the video, she remained silent for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Do you think this is a spirit?" Alice finally asked, her voice a little shaky. "I don't know what it is, but we can't keep ignoring it. It's becoming clearer, more present." Alice became pensive, biting her lower lip. She had always been skeptical about the supernatural, but recent events were making her reconsider her beliefs. Still, it was hard for her to accept that something so inexplicable was happening in her own home. Stuart, on the other hand, was beginning to feel that the situation was getting out of hand. The fact that the entity seemed to be manifesting itself more and more clearly in the recordings made him nervous. He no longer knew if it was safe to remain there, but at the same time, the idea of leaving the house didn't seem right. There was something he needed to understand, something that was still unclear. That night, Stuart decided to record for longer than usual. He adjusted the cameras to cover wider angles, placing one of them in the hallway and another in the bedroom, facing directly towards the closet. He was determined to capture something that would explain once and for all what was going on. As dawn approached, Stuart went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise seemed to echo in his mind, and he kept his eyes open, waiting for some sign. Thor, on the other hand, was calmer than on previous nights, which made him even more confused. The dog lay at the foot of the bed, occasionally raising his head to look down the corridor, but without showing the same agitation as before. At 3:15 in the morning, Stuart heard the knocks again. 3 dry knocks, as usual. His body reacted immediately, and he stood up quickly, grabbing his cell phone to check the cameras. He reviewed the live feed and, for a brief moment, thought he saw movement in the closet. A strange, almost imperceptible glow floated past. Thor, who was lying quietly, raised his head and began to watch the closet door. His tail wagged slowly, but he didn't bark or growl. Stuart felt a knot in his stomach. Something was there, and Thor's behavior only reinforced his suspicion. In the morning, when Alice woke up, Stuart was already reviewing the video from the night before. What he found was even more disturbing. In addition to the orb floating down the corridor, there was a hazy figure, much sharper than in the previous recordings. It was an almost human-shaped shadow, which seemed to move with more purpose. This time, it passed directly through the closet and disappeared into the bathroom, while Thor followed it with his eyes. Stuart paused the video several times, trying to identify more details. Each time he looked at the figure, his discomfort grew. That wasn't a technical error. It wasn't dust or a fault with the camera. It was something real, something that was with them, and it seemed to be getting closer and closer. In the morning, when Alice woke up, Stuart was already reviewing the video from the night before. What he found was even more disturbing. In addition to the orb floating down the corridor, there was a hazy figure, much sharper than in the previous recordings. It was an almost human-shaped shadow, which seemed to move with more purpose. This time it passed directly through the closet and disappeared into the bathroom, while Thor followed it with his eyes. Stuart paused the video several times, trying to identify more details. Each time he looked at the figure, his discomfort grew. That wasn't a technical error. It wasn't dust or a fault with the camera. It was something real, something that was with them, and it seemed to be getting closer and closer. The following night brought a different kind of restlessness. Stuart could hardly concentrate on anything during the day. Work, plans with Alice, and even Thor, who was always a pleasant distraction, couldn't take his mind off what was happening. He knew that something was lurking, something that had shown itself most clearly in the last recording. The misty, almost human figure haunted him in his thoughts. And he knew that the night promised to be even more intense. This time, he prepared differently. He placed the cameras strategically in the bedroom, the hallway and the bathroom. He wanted to make sure he captured any movement, any slightest manifestation. Thor, as always, seemed at ease, but Stuart no longer knew if that was a good sign. The dog saw things he couldn't see, and his calmness in the face of the entity only increased Stuart's apprehension. The clock was approaching 3 in the morning, and the silence in the house was almost oppressive. Alice slept soundly, oblivious to the tension in the air. Stuart remained awake, his eyes fixed on the screen of his cell phone, showing the live feed from the cameras. Thor, next to him, seemed restless, raising his head and watching the corridor more often than usual. When the clock struck exactly 3:15 in the morning, Stuart heard the sound. It wasn't the usual knocking. It was something different, a soft sound, like footsteps, echoing subtly down the corridor. Thor stood up immediately, his ears raised and his eyes fixed on the closet door. Stuart felt his heart racing, but remained silent, attentive to every movement. The sound continued, coming closer to the bedroom. Stuart looked at the camera in the hallway and saw the orb again, floating slowly towards the bedroom door. But this time, it wasn't alone. The shadow he had captured in the previous recordings was sharper, moving deliberately, almost as if it knew it was being watched. It was tall, its shape indistinct but undeniably human, with features that seemed to ripple through the air. Thor positioned himself in front of the door, emitting a low but not aggressive growl. His tail was still moving slowly, as if he was trying to understand its presence. Stuart, without blinking, kept his eyes on the screen as the shadow approached. The figure stopped for a moment, just in front of the room, before stepping through the door as if it wasn't a physical barrier. The air in the room suddenly seemed to get colder. Stuart felt a pressure in his chest, as if the atmosphere was becoming denser, harder to breathe. He looked into the space where the shadow should have been, but he couldn't see anything with his own eyes. Thor, on the other hand, stared straight into the closet, his back hair bristling. The dog was torn between alertness and curiosity, a duality that left Stuart even more confused. It was then that Stuart felt something touch his shoulder. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but enough to make his whole body stiffen. He turned around immediately, but there was nothing there. The space around him seemed empty, except for Thor, who was now standing still, watching intently. Stuart took a deep breath, trying to control the panic that threatened to take over his body. It was the first time he had felt anything physical, something that clearly indicated that the entity was no longer just a distant presence. He looked into the closet, which was still ajar. Something seemed to lurk in the background, hidden in the shadows. The familiar space, where they kept clothes and everyday objects, now seemed to have become a portal to something unknown. Stuart approached slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, and opened the door fully. The inside of the closet was dark, and the air inside was strange, thick. He tried to turn on the light, but it didn't work. With the flashlight on his cell phone, he illuminated the interior. Everything seemed in order, the clothes hung up, the boxes stacked, but the feeling that something was hidden there was undeniable. Thor, next to him, was growling low, but there was still no sign of fear. Stuart touched one of the inner walls of the closet, hoping for some sign, some clue that what he was feeling wasn't just a figment of his imagination. That's when he heard it. A whisper. This time, it wasn't muffled or distant. It was clear, direct, coming from somewhere deep in the closet. The words were inaudible, but the sensation was palpable. Stuart took a step back, panic beginning to build inside him. Thor gave a dry bark, as if to alert him to something else. And before he could react, the closet door slammed shut violently, as if pushed by an invisible force. Stuart immediately stepped back, his heart racing. Thor was on alert, but he didn't look scared, just alert. Silence reigned, but the atmosphere was charged with an almost unbearable tension. He looked at the closed closet door, knowing that somehow, whatever was inside had made direct contact with him for the first time. Now it was no longer a question of whether there was anything in the house. It was what that presence wanted and how far it was willing to go. Stuart felt his heart still pounding hours after what had happened in the closet. He was disturbed by the fact that, for the first time, the entity had made clear physical contact. It was no longer just a shadow or a whisper at the end of the corridor. Now, something was actively interacting with him and the house. Alice, still oblivious to what had happened, was beginning to worry about how Stuart was acting, but he hesitated to tell her the details. She hadn't yet experienced the presence in the same way he had. During the day, the house still had that strangely calm atmosphere. But at night, the tension seemed to build up like an impending storm. Stuart felt the air grow heavier with each approaching night, and his body reacted automatically, as if preparing for something greater to come. Thor, although calm during the day, also became more vigilant at night, especially when the sounds came again. That night, the tension in the air was more intense than usual. It was difficult to explain, but Stuart knew that something was changing, that the entity's behavior was becoming bolder. The knocks, which had previously been spaced out and discreet, were now more frequent and louder. almost as if the entity was trying to communicate more clearly. At around 3 in the morning, like a gloomy clock, the knocks began again. Stuart was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting. Thor, as always, was attentive, but this time there was something different about the dog. He was more restless, his body tense, his eyes fixed in the direction of the closet, which was now closed. Stuart got up slowly, already familiar with the pattern of the night, but this time the knocks didn't just come from the closet. They were all over the house. It was as if something was moving from room to room, hitting the walls hard, echoing down the corridors and through the doors. The knocks were rhythmic, almost like firm but distorted footsteps. Stuart moved cautiously across the room to the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by an oppressive silence in the corridor. Faint moonlight streamed in through the windows, but there was something wrong with the atmosphere. The air was heavy, dense, as if he were breathing through an invisible filter. Thor walked ahead, his steps light and cautious. The dog stopped suddenly and stared at the bathroom, growling softly. Stuart felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew something was there, but he couldn't see it. His hands sweating, he took out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the corridor. The light revealed a series of marks on the wall, scratches that hadn't been there before. Long, deep, as if something with claws had gone through there. The knocking began again, now more intense, coming directly from the bathroom. Thor advanced slowly, while Stuart followed close behind. When they reached the door, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Stuart felt his heart in his throat as he reached out to open the bathroom door. As he pushed the door open, the sensation of being watched intensified. The bathroom was apparently empty, except for a new condensation mark on the mirror, like invisible fingers that had touched its surface. Stuart held his breath, watching his reflection. And it was then that he saw, for a split second, the same hazy shadow, now sharper, passing down the hallway to the closet. Thor barked sharply, breaking the silence. Stuart ran back into the hallway, lighting the way with his cell phone. The closet was closed, but the sound of the knocks had moved in, louder and faster than ever. It was as if something was trying to get out. Stuart hesitated. He knew that opening that door again would mean facing whatever was in there. But before he could make a decision, the knocking stopped. An absolute silence filled the room, as sudden as it was disturbing. Thor, who had been agitated before, was now quiet, still staring at the closet door. Stuart took a step back, his whole body shaking with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It was then that he realized there was no longer a simple pattern to the sounds. Something was deliberately trying to communicate with him. The knocking, the tapping on his shoulder, the whispering, it all seemed part of a growing effort by the entity to make contact. But Stuart still didn't know what that meant. What did that presence want? Why was it intensifying its movements? Returning to his room, he sat on his bed, unable to sleep, his thoughts swirling around the unanswered questions. The beats hadn't stopped. He was sure of it. The pattern was changing. The entity was becoming bolder, stronger, and he felt that the house was somehow becoming an invisible battlefield between the known and the unknown. The next few nights would be crucial. He knew that. Something was lurking, and Stuart needed to be prepared for what came next. The tension inside the house seemed to reach a new level, as if the structure itself was conspiring against Stuart and Alice. Thor's behavior continued to be a mystery, alternating between restlessness and a strange tranquility that only increased the sense of unease. Stuart knew he could no longer ignore the situation. Each night, the presence became more visible, more palpable, and he sensed that something terrible was about to happen. That night, sleep did not come easily. Even exhausted, Stuart stayed awake for hours, mentally reviewing every detail of the last few weeks. The knocks, the shadows, the touch on his shoulder. All these events had been accumulating in a way he couldn't explain. Alice, on the other hand, had begun to show signs of wear and tear. She no longer slept as deeply as before and seemed to be affected by the oppressive atmosphere in the house, although she was reluctant to admit it. When she finally fell asleep, Stuart was immediately plunged into a disturbing dream. He was in the house, but everything seemed distorted, as if the walls were closer and the air heavier. He walked through the dark corridors, hearing the knocks echoing in the distance, but this time they weren't in the walls. They were coming from inside his own head, hammering on his skull with unbearable intensity. In the dream, he found himself in front of the closet again. The door was ajar, and something lurked in the dark interior. He tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor, as if the weight of the house was on him. The shadow inside the closet began to move towards him, gaining shape and density with each step. When the figure finally became visible, Stuart woke up with a jolt, his body covered in cold sweat. Next to him, Alice was also restless. She was mumbling something in her sleep, wriggling as if trying to escape from something. Stuart called to her softly, but she didn't wake up. He noticed that Thor, who was always at the foot of the bed, was also agitated, emitting little grunts as if he were in a dream of his own, perhaps sharing the same disturbance as the two humans in the house. The clock struck 3:10 in the morning. It was only 5 minutes before the knocks normally began. Stuart sat up in bed, his heart still racing from the nightmare, and watched Alice. She seemed trapped in a restless dream, her hands clutching the sheets and her breathing rapid and shallow. When the clock struck 3:15, the house seemed to sink into an even deeper silence. Stuart expected the knocks, but to his surprise, they didn't come. Instead, something much more disturbing happened. Alice, who was still asleep, began to speak. Her words were low and incoherent, but there was something sinister in her voice. Stuart shook her gently, trying to wake her up, but she didn't respond. Instead, she continued mumbling, the tone of her voice becoming deeper and more distorted. Thor, who had been restless before, now stood up and started growling, but his gaze wasn't on Alice. He stared at the closet, his back hair bristling. Stuart tried to focus on Alice, but his gaze kept being drawn to the closet. Something was different. The door, which had been closed when he fell asleep, was now ajar again. And there was a presence there, something he couldn't quite see, but felt like an invisible pressure in the air. It was then that Alice suddenly sat up, her eyes still closed. "You're here," she said, her voice hoarse and distant, as if she were in a trance. "You're watching." Stuart was paralyzed. His heart was beating so fast that he could hardly breathe. He called for Alice again, this time more forcefully, and finally she woke up, her eyes wide and confused. "What happened?" asked Alice, still dazed. "I was dreaming, but it seemed so real." Stuart didn't know what to say. He had dreamt too, and they were both beginning to experience something that transcended mere nocturnal discomfort. The nightmares they were having were not simply manifestations of fear. They were connected to the presence that inhabited the house. "I dreamt about the closet," Alice continued, her voice wavering. "Something was in there watching me. I couldn't move and everything was so dark. But I knew that if I opened the door, I couldn't go back." Stuart remained silent, his heart squeezing. He could no longer ignore what was happening, and clearly Alice was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. They were both being influenced by something that went beyond the physical, something that was messing with their minds and dragging them into a psychological terror they couldn't control. "I dreamt it too," Stuart finally said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I don't think it's a coincidence." The house was changing, and now it wasn't just during the nights. The dreams, the shadows, and the knocks, which had previously seemed to be isolated events, were coming together in a pattern that Stuart still couldn't decipher. But one thing was certain: the entity that inhabited the place was no longer just watching. It was getting closer and closer. Thor, still growling, stayed by Stuart's side, as if he knew that the threat had not disappeared. The coming nights promised to bring revelations, but what Stuart feared was that the entity, now much more active, was preparing something even darker for him and his family. Stuart spent the next day in a fog of unease. The nightmares he and Alice had shared the night before were not simple coincidences. There was something deeper going on, something that transcended the physical and messed with their minds in an almost unbearable way. He felt that the presence in the house was becoming more aggressive, more evident, and with each passing day, the feeling that something terrible was lurking only grew. After briefly discussing the dreams with Alice, they both decided that they could no longer ignore what was happening. Something was interfering in their lives in a frightening way, and they both agreed to keep a closer eye on any strange events that might occur. Thor, ever vigilant, seemed to be in tune with what was going on, but Stuart began to wonder if the dog knew more than he was letting on. That night, Stuart decided it was time to try recording everything again. He set up the cameras in the bedroom and hallway, making sure that the closet and bathroom were completely covered. The aim wasn't just to record the knocks or the shadows. He wanted to capture the presence clearly, leaving no doubt as to what was going on. As the hours progressed and night fell over the house, silence settled in thick and fast. Stuart, Alice, and Thor were waiting again, their senses heightened. At 3:15 in the morning, like clockwork, the events began. Stuart heard the unmistakable sound of knocks, but this time they weren't just dry rattling on the walls. They were accompanied by a faint rustling, as if something was moving along the corridor. Stuart checked the live feed from the cameras. In the corridor, the familiar light of the orb began to manifest itself, floating slowly from side to side. But unlike previous times, the orb seemed brighter, almost pulsating. It moved more deliberately, as if it had a purpose, and Stuart noticed something he had never noticed before. The orb followed a pattern. It went from the closet to the bathroom, repeating the movement in a precise line. "Do you see that?" Stuart asked Alice, who was already standing next to him, watching the screen. She nodded, her face pale with apprehension. "It's moving in a strange way," she said, her voice shaking. "It looks guided." As the orb continued on its way, Stuart noticed something else disturbing. The orb wasn't the only thing moving. As he increased the brightness of the camera and adjusted the contrast, he saw something in the corner of the screen. A subtle, almost imperceptible shadow that seemed to follow the orb from a distance, as if it were hiding, watching. Stuart froze. The shadow he had captured before, hazy and indistinct, was now clearer, more defined. It was a tall, slender figure, with contours that wavered in the air, but retained an almost human shape. It moved synchronously with the orb, but without interacting directly with it. It was as if it was guiding it. "There's something else there," said Alice, her voice now full of dread. "It's not just the orb, Stuart. There's something following it." Stuart felt an intense shiver run down his spine. He zoomed in, trying to understand what he was seeing. The orb continued on its way between the closet and the bathroom, but the shadowy figure seemed to be getting bolder. With each pass, it came closer, becoming more visible, as if it were testing the limits of reality. Then, suddenly, the orb stopped moving. It hung in the air in the middle of the corridor, pulsating strangely. Thor, who had been lying down until then, jumped up, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. The dog began to growl, a deep, threatening sound, as if he knew something was about to happen. Before Stuart could react, the orb exploded into a series of small beams of light that spread down the corridor, as if they had been dispersed by an invisible force. At the exact moment the light dissipated, the shadow that had previously been far away moved quickly towards the room. The figure crossed the corridor in a fluid movement, as if floating, and disappeared into the closet with frightening speed. Thor barked furiously, running towards the closet, but stopped abruptly at the entrance, as if he had crashed into an invisible barrier. For a brief moment, Stuart felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy, almost impossible to bear. Alice was pale, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen, where the camera still showed the empty corridor. "What was that?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. Stuart didn't know what to say. For the first time, he felt that the entity in the house was toying with them, testing their reactions, observing how far it could go. The lights, the shadows, the noises, it all seemed part of a game of which they didn't know the rules. He glanced at Thor, who was still growling in the direction of the closet. "Something's in there," Stuart murmured. "I can feel it." Alice nodded, speechless, as they both stood in silence, waiting for what else might happen. The atmosphere inside the house was heavier than ever. What had once seemed like a series of disconnected events was now revealing itself as part of something much bigger, a presence that fed on their anxieties, growing as fear took hold of Stuart and Alice. The previous night's experience with the orb and the shadowy figure had left them in a constant state of alert. They both knew they needed to understand the source of what was happening, but had no idea where to start. It was then that Stuart had the idea of investigating the history of the house. After all, the entity clearly had a connection to the place. He and Alice started looking for information about the previous owners and any events that might shed light on the phenomena they were experiencing. After hours of online research, Alice finally found something interesting. "Stuart, look at this," she said, pointing at the laptop screen. "Years ago, the previous owners reported strange experiences here, but no one ever took it seriously." Stuart read the news item carefully. The report was from a family who had lived there many years ago. They described sensations of being watched, objects that moved on their own, and shadows that appeared at night. Most disturbing was the mention of a dark figure manifesting itself in the closet and bathroom, exactly the same places where Stuart and Alice had witnessed the phenomena. "This can't be a coincidence," said Stuart, rubbing his face in frustration. "They saw the same thing as us. But why? What's in this place?" Alice continued to browse the article, and one sentence caught her eye. They mention here that the previous resident, before this family, was a lonely man who spoke of energies in the house. He said the place was connected to something, but no one ever understood what he meant. "Energies?" Stuart repeated thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why the shadows and the orb keep appearing. Something in this place is channeling these presences." The idea seemed absurd, but at the same time, it made sense. The house could be functioning as a kind of connection point, a place where the barriers between the world of the living and whatever that presence was were weakened. That same night, Stuart and Alice decided to be more proactive. Armed with the knowledge that the phenomenon was old and recurring, they set up their cameras, but this time with a plan in mind. Instead of simply waiting for something to happen, they began to document every last detail of the house. They checked every room, every wall, looking for clues that might help them understand what was causing the demonstrations. When they reviewed the video footage they had captured during the day, they noticed something peculiar. In the recordings of the corridor and the closet, the orb appeared much more faintly during the day, almost invisible but still present. The shadow, on the other hand, didn't seem to exist in sunlight. Stuart felt that this was an important clue. The entity gained strength at night, fed by the darkness and the energies that seemed to converge on the house. However, as they prepared for another night, something unexpected happened. Alice, who was adjusting one of the cameras, felt a slight pressure on her shoulder. She froze and looked around, but there was no one there. Stuart, noticing her discomfort, approached her. "What is it?" "I felt something," said Alice, looking at the spot where she had been touched. "It's like it's here, right now." Before they could process what was happening, Thor started barking desperately. He was in the hallway, in front of the closet, his body rigid and his eyes fixed on the ajar door. Stuart and Alice rushed over to him, knowing that something was about to happen. Silence gripped the house for a moment, and then the knocks began. This time, the knocks weren't just in the closet. They reverberated throughout the house as if something was trying to escape from everywhere. The feeling that the room was being compressed was overwhelming, and the fear was almost palpable. Stuart and Alice stood still, unable to move, as the knocks got louder and faster. Suddenly, the sound ceased. A deathly silence overtook the house, and Stuart realized that something had changed. The air seemed lighter, as if a tension had been released. It was then that the closet slowly began to open on its own. Thor, still growling, moved forward a little, but hesitated, clearly sensing that something invisible was there. Stuart took out his cell phone and illuminated the inside of the closet. The clothes were there as always, but when he focused on the bottom, he noticed something different. A mark, a strange symbol carved into the wood that he had never seen before. It was a circle with intertwined lines, almost like a labyrinth, and in the center, a deep spot, as if something was stuck there. "What's that?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," replied Stuart, carefully touching the mark. As he did so, he felt a slight tremor in the house, as if the ground was vibrating for a brief moment. It was then that Stuart realized the house wasn't just a place for supernatural events. It was a portal, a connection to something much bigger and much more dangerous. Whatever was there was trapped, but now it seemed to be gaining strength, trying to escape. They had found the source of the presence, but still had no idea how to deal with what was coming. Stuart and Alice stood in front of the closet, unable to take their eyes off the strange symbol carved into the wood. That circle, with its intricate lines and the deep dot in the center, emanated a feeling of discomfort that Stuart couldn't describe. He felt certain that they had discovered something crucial about the entity that haunted the house. Thor, who until then had been intrepid, now walked slowly away, still growling at the closet, as if he knew they had crossed an invisible boundary. "This is getting worse," said Alice, her voice low and tense. "We've messed with something that should have stayed buried." Stuart nodded, his eyes fixed on the symbol. "We have to find out what it means. Maybe it's the key to understanding why all this is happening." Despite his growing fear, Stuart knew he had to act. They couldn't go on ignoring the fact that the presence in the house was becoming stronger, more aggressive. The knocks that had previously seemed random now reverberated throughout the house, as if the entity was trying to break free. And the symbol in the closet seemed to be the focal point of everything. That night was unlike any other. As soon as the clock struck 3 in the morning, the physical manifestations began to intensify. The air inside the house was heavier, almost suffocating, and Stuart felt the temperature drop sharply, as if the room was being sucked into an icy vacuum. Thor, normally the first to alert any presence, was quiet this time, curled up at the foot of the bed, refusing to move. Stuart and Alice stood in silence, waiting. It was then that the first sound came, the dragging of something heavy in the hallway, as if furniture was being pushed, but nothing in the house had moved. The sound echoed through the space, and soon doors began to slam on their own. It was no longer just an invisible presence. The entity was manifesting its power in the physical environment in a way they had never seen before. Alice got out of bed, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" "Yes," Stuart replied, his voice hoarse. "It's moving all over the house." As they approached the bedroom door, the knocks came again, but not like before. Now they were loud, firm knocks that seemed to come from all sides. Stuart opened the door, and the corridor was in complete darkness, except for a faint flashing light at the end, near the closet. He knew that the symbol had been the catalyst for all this, but he had no idea what to do to stop it. "We have to get out of here," said Alice, her voice trembling. Stuart hesitated. Part of him knew that running away could be a temporary solution, but another part, the more rational part, understood that the entity was linked to the house. Wherever they went, that thing would still be there, waiting, gaining more strength. They decided to investigate once more. With flashlights in hand, they headed down the corridor. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, as if the air around them was becoming thicker, denser. As they neared the closet, the lights of their flashlights began to flicker, as if their own electricity was being drained by the presence around them. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed downstairs, as if something heavy had been dropped. Stuart and Alice ran to the stairs, lighting the way. When they reached the living room, they saw that all the furniture was out of place. The table was overturned, chairs were thrown across the floor, and the paintings that had once hung on the walls were now scattered across the floor, as if they had been ripped down with brutal force. Alice gasped in shock, her hand shaking. That's not possible. But before they could even process what was happening, another sound filled the house. It was the sound of something scratching the walls, like long nails scraping against wood. The sound grew louder, and the feeling of being watched came back full force. Stuart knew they were in danger, that the entity was getting closer and closer to full manifestation. They ran back to the bedroom, where Thor, now standing, was growling down the corridor. Stuart quickly closed the door, locking it with a sharp movement. He turned to Alice, who was pale but trying to keep her composure. "We need to find out what this symbol means," he said, with determination in his voice. "That's the key. The thing is trying to get out, but it's stuck somehow." Alice began searching for more information online, trying to decipher what that symbol might represent. Every minute seemed like an eternity as the sounds continued around them. Banging on the walls, objects falling, the sound of something dragging through the house. The entity was making its presence known more and more, and Stuart felt that time was running out. Finally, Alice found something. "Stuart, look at that," she exclaimed, pointing at the screen. "That symbol is an ancient seal. It was used in rituals to imprison evil entities. Someone trapped this thing here. It's trapped, but it's getting stronger." Stuart's heart raced. Now it made sense. The entity was trapped inside the house, and the symbol in the closet was the anchor that kept it there. But something was changing. The entity was finding ways to manifest itself, using fear and the surrounding energies to gain power. "So it wants to break free," said Stuart, his voice heavy. "And we're helping." Now that they knew what was happening, the question was how to stop the entity from escaping. Stuart and Alice were on full alert. The discovery of the symbol and the fact that the entity was trapped inside the house trying to break free terrified them. They knew they couldn't simply ignore what was happening, but they weren't sure how to act either. The sound of knocks and scratches continued to echo throughout the house, as if the entity was testing the limits of its confinement, looking for a loophole to escape. "If this seal is trapping the entity, then there must be a way to strengthen it, or at least prevent it from breaking free for good," said Stuart, as Alice reviewed more information about the symbol. "Yes, but how? This is ancient magic, something no one fully understands. We have no idea how to reinforce the seal," replied Alice, her tone desperate, although she tried to remain calm. The sound of something heavy falling downstairs interrupted the conversation. Stuart exchanged a glance with Alice and, without saying a word, picked up the flashlight and went downstairs. Thor followed close behind, still growling low, but ready to face whatever was there. The knocks were more frequent now, as if the entity was getting impatient. Arriving in the living room, Stuart and Alice found an even more chaotic scene. Objects that had been perfectly in place not long ago were now scattered across the floor, as if a tornado had passed through the room. The curtains swayed slightly, even with the windows closed, and there was an inexplicable chill in the air. "She's getting stronger," said Alice, observing the mess around her. "We don't have much time." Stuart looked at the symbol in the closet. He knew it was the key, but he wasn't sure how to use it. They needed to find out more, fast. "Let's focus on how the symbol was drawn. Maybe there's something about it that we can replicate or activate." They returned upstairs, where the symbol at the back of the closet continued to pulse with a strange energy. By shining a closer light on it, Alice realized that there were small marks around the circle, almost like inscriptions that had been hidden in time. "Look at that," she said, pointing. "Those are additional symbols around it. It looks like whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Stuart moved closer to look. The markings were intricate, with details that hinted at something ritualistic, ancient, and carefully planned. "If these symbols have kept the entity trapped until now, perhaps we can reactivate them, or at least try to stop it from breaking the seal." Alice began to draw the marks on a piece of paper, studying each line with precision. "Maybe we can draw these symbols around the house, create a barrier that might prevent it from getting any stronger." The idea seemed desperate, but it was the only thing they had. Stuart nodded in agreement, and the two set to work. Using chalk, they began to draw the symbols at strategic points in the house, on each door, around the windows, and at the main entrances. Thor followed them closely, sniffing the air suspiciously, as if he knew something invisible was moving. As they drew the symbols, the physical manifestations began to increase. The knocks on the walls were now so loud that it felt like the whole house was shaking. An intense scratching ran through the hallway, and Stuart felt a presence pass quickly by him, like a gust of icy wind. "She's trying to stop us," said Alice, drawing faster. "She knows what we're doing." Time seemed to be running against them. The knocks were getting louder, closer together, and the air was becoming denser and denser. Suddenly, Thor started barking frantically, running towards the closet. He was agitated, as if something invisible was trying to get out. Stuart ran over to the dog, trying to calm him down, but it was as if Thor was in a trance, trying to warn him about something that only he could see. "What's happening to him?" Alice asked, her voice filled with panic. Stuart didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to the closet. Something was happening in there, something he couldn't explain. The symbol at the bottom was pulsing more intensely, almost as if it was reacting to what they had done in the house. Suddenly, a deafening sound reverberated throughout the house. It was like an explosion of energy, and Stuart and Alice were thrown backwards, as if an invisible force had pushed them. The air around them was so heavy that it was difficult to breathe, and for a moment, the floor shook violently. When they finally managed to stand up, they looked around and realized that the symbol on the closet had changed. It now glowed with a faint light, almost as if it were alive. But the entity also seemed more present than ever. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of imminent danger, as if something terrible was about to happen. Alice approached Stuart, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But before they could react, the symbol in the closet emitted one last pulse, and the beats ceased completely. Absolute silence fell over the house, the kind of silence that precedes something worse. Stuart knew, at that moment, that whatever was trapped in there was finally on the verge of breaking free. And they were at the center of it all. Time was running out, and now only one question remained. What would they do to stop the worst from happening? Stuart and Alice stood paralyzed, looking at the closet which, until a few minutes ago, had seemed like a simple storage space. Now the symbol at the bottom pulsed with an energy that they could feel in the air, like an invisible pressure that threatened to explode at any moment. The silence was so dense that it was deafening, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome. Thor was still, standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the closet, but not making a sound. He seemed to understand that the danger was there, that something was about to manifest itself definitively. Stuart knew they didn't have much time. They had to act, but what could they do? The entity was about to break free, and the attempts to use the symbols as a barrier had only delayed the inevitable. "Stuart, we need to get out of here," said Alice, her voice low but urgent. She was shaking, and her wide eyes showed that fear was taking over. This won't stop. We've touched something we don't understand." "I know," replied Stuart, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on the closet. "But if we leave now, she might break free completely. And then, what will happen? Will she follow us? Will she stay here, waiting for the next family?" Alice hesitated, clearly frightened by the idea of leaving the entity free to torment other people. "So what do we do? We can't fight it." Stuart took a deep breath, trying to control his panic. He knew that they didn't have the tools or the knowledge to resolve the situation completely, but he also knew that they couldn't just run away. It was then that he had an idea, something that had been forming in his mind ever since the demonstrations started to get stronger. "I'm going to record it," said Stuart with surprising calm. "If we can't stop it, at least we can document what's happening, show the world what's going on here so that no one else falls into this trap." Alice looked at him as if he were mad. "Record it? That won't change anything." "Maybe not," he admitted, picking up his cell phone. "But maybe it's the only way to leave clear evidence. If something happens to us, someone has to know what's here. Someone has to be prepared to deal with it." Reluctantly, Alice nodded. They didn't have many options, and Stuart was right about one thing. The world needed to know what happened in that house. Stuart started recording. The video showed the closet, the symbol still pulsing, and the oppressive silence all around. He tried to keep his voice steady, explaining what they had discovered about the house, about the beats, the shadows, and the manifestations that were becoming more and more intense. He talked about the seal, about how they believed the entity had been trapped there for many years, feeding off the fear and energy of those who lived in the house. As he recounted the events, Alice kept her eyes fixed on the closet, as if she expected something to jump out at any moment. Thor, next to her, remained silent, but the muscles in his body were tense, ready to react. Suddenly, the symbol at the back of the closet shone brightly, like a light bulb about to burn out. The glow was followed by a deafening sound, a crash that reverberated throughout the house. The pressure in the air increased, and Stuart almost lost his balance. Thor started barking uncontrollably, while Alice screamed in sheer terror. It was then that the entity finally revealed itself. A dark figure emerged from the closet, tall and distorted, like a shadow taking on shape and density. It had no face, just an overwhelming presence that filled the entire space around it. The temperature dropped sharply, and Stuart felt the air around him compress, as if he were being sucked into a vacuum. He continued recording, despite the panic that gripped his body. The figure moved slowly towards them, each step a torment of darkness that seemed to consume the very light of the house. Thor was in an attack position, barking and advancing, but the entity didn't seem to care about him. "Stuart, run!" shouted Alice, grabbing him by the arm, but he couldn't move. He was hypnotized by the presence, pinned to the ground by the sheer terror of facing something so beyond his comprehension. The figure came closer and closer, and Stuart knew that they were about to be swallowed up by it. It was then, in an act of desperation, that Alice picked up the chalk they had used to draw the symbols and quickly traced a circle around them. The newly drawn symbol glowed briefly, and the entity stopped. It hesitated, as if it couldn't cross the makeshift barrier. Time seemed to stop. The figure stood motionless for a few seconds, watching them from afar, before slowly retreating into the closet. The symbol at the bottom began to glow again, and with a final bang, the closet closed violently, as if the house itself was trying to contain what was inside. Silence returned.